To help us make sense of this week's political news, we're joined now by Bloomberg White House reporter Jennifer Jacobs. Dan Balz is the chief correspondent at The Washington Post. Rachael Bade covers Congress for Politico. And Ed O'Keefe is a congressional reporter for The Washington Post, and he's also a CBS News contributor. Thanks, everyone, for joining me today. Jennifer, I want to start with you. You just heard Mark Short say that as far as he knows, the president has not expressed a serious interest or expressed an order to fire the White House special counsel. Is that true?
If you ask different White House aides, you hear different recollections. I've talked to at least a dozen White House officials about this, and some of them sincerely say, I don't remember the president ever saying anything like that. In fact, they say definitively he never ordered Don McGahn, the White House counsel, to fire Mueller. Apparently, this was a conversation with a very small, tight group. So it depends on who you talk to, but keep in mind, 48 White House officials, campaign staff, or people affiliated with the campaign have spoken with Mueller or to the congressional committees. That's a lot of people who are preparing for testimony or for speaking with Mueller. There's a particular group that share a lawyer. That's 3 people. That's Steve Bannon, Reince Priebus, and Don McGahn share a lawyer. So they theoretically could be talking about their recollections back at the time, and this piece of history could have come up in one of those recollections. I've also heard from one person that there's some tension between Don McGahn and another White House lawyer, Ty Cobb, and that's where this could be coming from. So there's a lot of different theories, but depending on who you ask, some of them will sincerely say they have no recollection of this happening. Others say, yeah, but it was just to a tight audience.
Dan, even Republicans this week were not surprised to hear that the president mulled over the possibility of firing Mueller. After all, he's tweeted that this investigation is a witch hunt 22 times.
Yes, that's right. And I think that the reporting that has been done on this has been pretty clear. I mean, the story was broken by the New York Times. It was quickly confirmed by many other organizations, ours among them. I think that there's little doubt that this happened. And in some ways, there's not a surprise that it happened. I mean, there are a series of things that the president has said and done over the course of many months to indicate his distaste for this investigation and his desire in one way or another to get in the way of it. Now, what that adds up to is going to be left to the special counsel to make a declaration, and then people can draw further conclusions from that. But we know that he is unhappy with this investigation.
Ed, Senate aides tell me they're now working very quickly to try to combine these 2 bills that are out there that would basically protect the special counsel from firing. Does this incident give that legislation more momentum?
Conceivably, because here we are talking about it after months of not talking about it. It's 2 different plans that essentially permit judicial review in the event that special counsel would be fired. What's notable is that there are Republicans involved in this, because over the summer when this became an issue, they got concerned and understood that this could become a thing. The problem is, we've seen this morning and we've seen in recent days Republican leaders say we don't see a need necessarily to bring up this legislation right now. That said, can recall talking especially to Democratic aides in the last few months who've said if this had happened, or if it happens, in the midst of all the ongoing negotiations over the budget and immigration and the threats of shutdown, the Democrats would conceivably put a halt to it all and force the issue by either having that legislation attached to the bill or at least saying, we're not doing anything until you address this. But this isn't necessarily that, because it happened so many months ago and there's evidence that people stood in the way of it. It's if he tries again that you may see a grind to a halt on the Hill.
They're saying this is a red line. Rachel, at the same time, you've got House Republicans trying to give the president a little bit of cover and pushing this notion that the very foundations of this FBI investigation are flawed, are biased. Are they winning hearts and minds on that argument?
They're certainly winning over a lot of the Republican base. I think I saw a poll this week that said 75% of Republicans think that the Russia investigation is just to undermine the credibility of the president. Going back to this, I think Republican leaders are not necessarily going to put legislation on the floor to protect Mueller, and that's because this reporting, it happened 7 months ago, and they also note that he ultimately didn't do it. And as Susan Collins mentioned in your interview this morning, he doesn't have the ability to do that. That's Rod Rosenstein, who is clearly at the DOJ and is still in his position and has said he is going to allow Mueller to do his job. At the same time, you see Republicans sort of holding up right now these text messages between 2 FBI officials they think had anti-Trump sentiments. one of them expressing how he or she did not want to probe Hillary Clinton very hard because they were worried she would win the presidency and she would be their future boss. So yes, they are trying to go after the FBI. I think Republicans are winning over their base on this, but most Americans still, of course, support Mueller.
And Dan, Rachel raises a good point. I mean, if the president wanted to fire Mueller, but at the end of the day didn't go through with it, does it matter?
Well, it matters because it does show his desire and sentiment, particularly at that moment. And it's important that Don McGahn stood in the way of it to the degree that how that all unfolded, we're not exactly sure, but Don McGahn, in one way or another, prevented it from happening. But to Rachel's point, I mean, if he moved to try to do this, there are other obstacles that he would face. But again, if he did it, and again were blocked, I think it would create an even bigger firestorm than this incident that we didn't know about at the time, other than his friend Chris Ruddy, who had indicated in a public interview with Judy Woodruff on PBS that the president was in fact considering this sort of thing. So it's not as though this was totally tightly held. I mean, he had obviously shared it with Mr. Ruddy of his desire at the time, but there are safeguards built in. But we, go back to the Saturday Night Massacre with Richard Nixon and during Watergate. It took a number of steps ultimately for that to be executed, but it could be the same kind of thing we would have this time.
I want to turn to immigration and Ed, ask you, now that the White House has finally laid out its stance, notwithstanding Mark Short saying it's actually been out there for months, does it give conservatives cover to support a Dreamer bill that they know is going to anger a significant segment of their base?
If the changes in family-based legal migration are part of the final package, and if they get the 25 to 30 billion in border security, yeah. But if not, they'll stand against it. I think what this plan from the White House, which is formally being released on Monday, shows now is that the debate over whether or not to legalize or provide legal protections to people who are protected by DACA is basically over. It's just an issue of how many. But with the president going all the way to 1.8 million, that basically settles it. The fact that Chuck Schumer went to the White House a little more than a week ago, sat with the president and basically agreed on $25 billion in border funding means that that's over. Democrats have now flashed that card and said, if that's the price to pay, so be it. There will be some who don't like it, but he basically put them there. So the question is, are those other issues regarding family-based migration, changes to what's called the diversity lottery included? And that, I think, now is where the fight will be, because this is an issue of, can a DACA recipient's parents stay here legally? Can they bring a brother and sister? Could their spouse also get it if they're old enough and they're married? And those are emotional fights now over the size and scope of one's family once they get their legal status.
Right.
It's going to be a painful piece of the debate. It's why you're seeing some say, let's have a narrow debate over DACA and border security. That's Congress for, let's have an easier fight over border security and DACA, which we seem to basically have agreement on.
Jennifer, why did the White House suddenly come out in favor of a pathway to citizenship?
Well, they have been privately signaling that they would be willing to give the Dreamers a pathway to citizenship. The concession that they made here was going from the 690,000 to the 1.8 million. That is a change. Like Mark said, they've been saying that for a while, that they would allow the path to citizenship. They just didn't want to show their cards on how many. But I was told by one Trump insider that this would help them with, for example, Republican college-aged women. A lot of things come down to, the electorate and how things turn out in the vote. They also don't want to appear too nativist. That's another reason. But also, speaking of the vote, one thing to keep in mind is that these Dreamers wouldn't be able to vote themselves until about 2028, long after Trump is gone.
Right. This is a long pathway to citizenship. Rachel, you wrote this week about the fact that Speaker Ryan is essentially a centrist on this issue, but he's also afraid to cross conservatives.
Yeah, the immigration debate is not just about the future of Dreamers, it's about the future of a speaker. Paul Ryan has said many times that he is sympathetic to the Dreamers. He doesn't think they should be deported. They came here as young minors, only know the United States as home. However, he governs a very conservative House Republican conference who, by the way, do not support a pathway to citizenship for this population. And they made him promise when he became speaker that he would never put an immigration bill on the floor that does not get a majority of the majority. However, what we're talking about in the Senate right now probably would not get a majority of the majority. The one anecdote I would say anecdote for this toxic concoction for the speaker is President Trump. If he embraces a bipartisan solution, maybe it protects Ryan.
Rachel. That's the last word. Thank you so much, Rachel, Ed, Dan, Jennifer. Appreciate you being with us today.